There was a figure just down the hallway, pursuing him through familiar rooms and narrow passageways. He could hear it talking, speaking things nearly incomprehensible to him. He continued to run. Hallways curved and spiraled into mad mazes, pulling him in circles as his stalker closed in. He turned a corner, desperately attempting to find his breath. Without warning, it was there, in front of him. The figure, tall and foreboding. It moved with a terrifying speed to ambush him. Then he awoke. A shrill voice rang through the door of a cramped apartment. "Oi, Armani, rent's due. Wake the fuck up!" A young man rolled out of bed, fumbling over his feet as he approached the door. He yanked on the handle and let the door fall open as far as the chain bolt would allow. An old, diminutive man stood before him, hand already outstretched towards the gap in the door. He spoke again with a tone that could make a saint sneer. "You know the deal. Hand it over and I don't come in there to beat your ass today." Sighing, the young Armani grabbed a wad of cash from the counter in his room. He placed it in the man's hand as he attempted to muster up an amicable response. "See you next month, Mr. Fogarty." The old man mumbled a neutral response and left, leaving Armani to close his door and plunge the apartment back into darkness. The town of Avonside was always bustling, even before the rising sun set a glare upon its snowy streets. Entirely separated from most other outside sources, the town made a remarkably cozy community for those who chose to live within. Centered around a single main road, the main strip formed a sort of town center from which a small spattering of residential areas propagated. It was in one of these particular neighborhoods that Armani Laurent made the beginning of his daily routine. Taking the first frigid step out of the apartment building he called home, an internal voice immediately begged him to stay inside, just for the day. He silenced it as he reminded himself of the urgency of his task. The walk to the nearest coffee shop was short and silent. Main Street was always bustling, but back-end sections of Avonside were eerily quiet, especially at this time of morning. Pressing on up the cold street, the glaring neon sign of Buttercup Cafe came into view. The owner greeted him with a smile as she did every day, politely asking if he'd like the usual. A murmur or vaguely positive grunt was usually all it took to communicate his approval. He stopped himself for the first time in years after she went behind the counter to begin his order. Did she think he was just some rude teenager? He let the thought simmer for some time until she came back to the front counter with a steaming cup of espresso. Stumbling over his own words, he barely got out the first piece of conversation he'd directed towards her since he'd moved to the small town. "Thanks, Miss Stauber." He didn't even stay to let her respond, simply backing out of the door with his cup in hand. Time to go check on the father, he thought to himself. The local church of Avonside was humble, yet surprisingly pristine. It was run by a single man, Father Emilio. He'd moved in some years ago and restored the church by hand, making it into a surprisingly homely establishment. The same could be said about Emilio himself. He was a surprisingly frail, aging man. Despite that, he kept a distinct look of vigor about him. On this particular morning, he'd taken to dusting the pews. He was finishing a row as Armani entered through the double doors of the building. Armani's blonde mess of hair was even worse looking than usual, but the priest gave him a kind look and smiled. Anyone was welcome in the house of the Lord, even if they were less than presentable. "Greetings, Armani. Here a bit early this morning, aren't you?" His voice boomed through the empty rafters as he spoke. Armani held a false smile, one he'd practiced on the seemingly demure priest exclusively. "It's never too early for worship, Father Emilio. I'm sure you know that as well as anyone," he contended, moving away from the entrance to take a seat at the back row of pews. Emilio left him alone, returning to his work. He told the priest the same lie nearly every day. His hours of silent contemplation weren't prayer or even meditation. He was observing Emilio, watching him for absolutely any sign of suspicion. Though he looked older, less affluent, and borderline decrepit, there was still a terrifying aura about him. The aura of a man who had once exterminated an entire universe. The aura of Enrico Pucci. Though the villainous priest was killed at his own hand, fate had recreated him anew through the machinations of his evolved stand, made in heaven. Responsibility asked of him to prevent the priest from ever regaining his memory somehow. Though he went by Armani, the name of this young man was Emporio El Nino. After some time, Armani got sick of watching the priest tidy up and stood up to leave. As he pushed the heavy doors of the church open, a stray beam of sunshine blinded him, twisting his face into a weary grimace. There wasn't much to do during the winter, not for someone in his line of work anyway. Turns out, trying to keep an eye on a potentially psychotic priest in some remote tundra town, while also fulfilling your dream of being a baseball instructor, was pretty inconvenient. He sucked in another breath of frigid air and proceeded down the now lit pathway to his apartment. There was an immediate shift in atmosphere as the sound of two arguing voices broke the peaceful silence that usually filled the entrance of the small apartment building. Mr. Fogarty had climbed on top of the front desk and was shouting directly into the face of a remarkably tall man. "You pay up front, or you get the fuck out," spat the old landlord, poking a finger into the man's chest. Armani cast his gaze towards the guest, taking note of his gaudy attire. He was wearing an orange trench coat over a tattered white dress shirt, and his messy black hair was tied back into a small bun. Without warning, his voice exploded to match Fogarty's volume. "The precinct already called you, dumbass. I'll have the money for my room later today." Mr. Fogarty spat at his face, pressing his finger deep into the man's chest. "Cop or no, you still have to pay when you arrive. Them's the breaks." Suddenly, his lips curled into a wry smile as he stepped down from the counter. "Perhaps I've been too rude. Please, proceed to your room. I'll come and get the money later." There wasn't a moment of doubt in Armani's head. Looking behind Mr. Fogarty's hunched figure, he saw a loose wallet firmly grasped in the landlord's sweaty hands. As much as Fogarty's habits annoyed him, Armani would regularly turn a blind eye to them. It wasn't worth risking his living situation over petty theft. In the single instance that Armani lost himself to inner thoughts, something changed. The stranger's wallet was flying through the air from Mr. Fogarty's open palm. It landed in the outstretched hand of the guest as he walked away, a sly grin spread across his face. "I appreciate you returning my lost wallet. Maybe you aren't so bad after all." His voice echoed all the way across the lobby. Shaken, Armani proceeded into the door and greeted the landlord, now leaning against the counter with a distinct shudder. "Everything all right, sir?" he asked, leaning down to look the short elderly man in the eyes. Without a word, the dumbstruck man stumbled past Armani and out the entrance of the building. Armani crossed his arms. Something was wrong with the picture, and intuition told him it was probably a stand attack. Under his breath, he whispered a single word, the name of the ability he had refined for years. Havona. In the center of the room, a thin fog began to materialize and coalesce, as if the wind itself had become a specter. The shadow of something humanoid could be seen within, should another stand user be watching. This power was a strange one, something that Armani had to adjust to. In another world, his stand ability had simply been to create ghost rooms. Things had changed, though. A single person can only have one stand, and when that rule is inevitably broken, it must be resolved in some way. Even despite the power to control weather via his borrowed stand weather report, the ability had slipped away from him over the years. Assuming it was simply the borrowed stand fading away, he became resigned to the notably weaker stand that actually belonged to him. He'd been attempting to recreate old versions of the rooms in his apartment building to push the limits of his ability when it happened. Instead of simply creating a ghost object or room, the weather seemed to mimic the object he was focusing on. Though it was a surprise at the time, it was the perfect tool needed to solve mysteries just like the one he was presently occupied with. Focusing his ability, he directed the stand to recreate Mr. Fogarty's position. As if an outline had been created in the dense fog, the silhouette of the elderly landlord appeared. Immediately, something was off about his figure. There were noticeable bumps on its arms, barely defined but still present. Armani moved within the figure of the landlord, doing his best to position his arm into the same place as the silhouette, despite the proportional difference. Focusing his ability once again, the gas solidified into ice near the suspicious bumps to form a set of cogs. Wide-toothed, almost cartoon-like. Brushing the shapes of ice off his arm, he proceeded to focus his ability on recreating solid objects. One by one, cogs were created and fell due to gravity, seemingly making a line up Fogarty's arm, down his back, and to the ground via the back of his leg. The chain of gears then stopped where the stranger had stood before. Releasing this ability, each of the frozen cogs melted back into water and disappeared. Electing to avoid the stranger for the time being, Armani returned to his apartment to gather his thoughts. Flicking on the TV, he took a seat on the rotting couch that had come with the apartment. Though it was an admittedly bad habit, he summoned Havona once again and directed it to recreate something he did nearly every night. Gusts of wind began to ravage his apartment, sending loose papers flapping about. One of the squalls opened a high cupboard in the room's kitchenette, exposing a row of liquor bottles. In rapid succession, another puff sent a bottle of gin tipping forward, while a third puff aligned a glass cup with the splash zone below. It seemed like the process always made a little less mess the more he did it. He didn't want to risk ruining the kitchen, so he simply retrieved the cup by hand and returned to his seat. This was going to be a long night. A lone figure trudged down the streets of Avonside, making a flustered beeline towards the local church. Bursting through the door, one Mr. James Fogarty practically shouted his way into the parlor of Emilio Coveri, stumbling over his feet all the way. Opening his mouth to get the attention of the priest, the landlord was immediately cut off. "Awfully late for a prayer, aren't we?" the priest cooed, stepping out of a shadow cast by the altar in pale moonlight. "You know I can't always be here for confession." The elderly man tried to respond, but he only managed to sputter. "Father, something happened. No man of God could make something move without touching it, could he?" The priest immediately moved closer to Fogarty, casting a menacing gaze over him. "Tell me more of this incident. What did you see?" he muttered, his voice steeled to an icy tone. Fogarty once again attempted to speak, but again was interrupted. Another voice came from behind, speaking calmly. "Surely there's no risk in proceeding, Father. This is our first lead in some time." Fogarty whipped around to face the new presence, but was instantly blindsided by a sharp pain in his back. The priest moved in closer, and the feeling of icy metal in his back confirmed Fogarty's worst suspicions. He had been stabbed. The priest chuckled lightly, letting go of the implement in Fogarty's back. "Let's see how he does, shall we? I'll keep an eye on our little experiments, you get back to the rest." Without another word, the nameless figure disappeared, leaving the two alone. For Fogarty, it was like the world was spinning. His head felt as if he had come down with the worst fever a plague could muster, and the pain in his back grew exponentially. Hours seemed to pass as he remained motionless, feeling the metal implement in his back worm its way deeper into the wound. Emilio Coveri would return a few minutes later to check on the old man, observing him in what appeared to be a peaceful slumber. It had worked. Calling upon an ability that only he knew, he reached down and touched Fogarty's head. As if a solid plate had formed, a single metallic disc emerged and exited the man's head. On the disc read two simple words, ones that Emilio could not understand, but gave him a name for the ability the geriatric man had gained. Fortunate Son.